question isn't, are we going to have a recession? The question is it going to be a depression? If we just get away with a recession, we're getting off easy. But I don't think there's any way that the payoff, or the payback rather, for over a decade of 0% interest rates and massive quantitative easing, I don't think we're going to get away with just a mere recession as a result of that. It's going to be a depression, and I think it will be worse than what is known as the Great Depression, the one that we experienced during the 1930s. The banks are very exposed, and anything that was interest rate sensitive is in a bubble, because we had interest rates at zero or practically zero for over 10 years. And so during that period of time, a lot of debt was taken on to buy a lot of assets. And because the interest rates were so low, people buying those assets could overpay. And so it was the low interest rates that helped to inflate the bubbles. That's the same thing that happened in the bubble that popped in 2008. And one of the reasons I was able to see it so clearly before it popped is because I recognized how Fed policy had inflated it. And, even before that bubble popped, I was forecasting the next one, which is the one that we've been living in for that entire decade. The only thing that's surprising to me is not that it's deflating, but that it took so long. But the current banking crisis is just another financial crisis. It's caused by the same factors that caused the last one, which is the Fed and its easy money policies, quantitative easing, 0% interest rates, except this time the Fed succeeded in inflating a much bigger bubble than the one that popped in 2008. And I think the 2023 financial crisis is going to be a lot worse than the 2008 financial crisis. And it's probably not going to end in 2023. It's probably going to bleed into 2024. Every segment of the economy took on too much debt. Now, obviously, the banks are very vulnerable because the banks own a lot of that debt. But corporate America is in a lot of trouble. Where do you think corporations got the money for all these share buybacks? Most of it was borrowed, and a lot of those loans are going to come due. So it's not just the commercial real estate sector, but corporate America that's in trouble. And Americans also have record debt. We have credit card debt, student loans, auto loans, mortgage debt. None of this debt would be anywhere near as large if it wasn't for how low interest rates were, because that's what made the payments affordable. But as interest rates reset, the payments become unaffordable. And the other problem is the buyers of these mortgages and bonds. I was pointing this out for years before Silicon Valley blew up, but I was warning about the impact this was going to have on banks and every other creditor when interest rates inevitably rose, and they would have to rise much higher than anybody thought because inflation would be a much bigger problem than anybody imagined, but that this would result in significant losses for the lenders. And we're just seeing the tip of that iceberg now. And I think that the losses in banks will be a lot greater than it was in the 30s, not necessarily because the banks fail. They would fail if the government allowed them to, but because they're going to get bailed out with inflation. And because the government is going to have to print so much money to keep all these insolvent institutions afloat, the value of everybody's savings is going to sink. The dollar is going to collapse and inflation is going to run through the roof. I think in general, economic downturns end up being inflationary in that what happens is that you have fewer people productively employed, and so you're not making as much stuff. But as the economy contracts, governments respond to that contraction by pursuing highly inflationary fiscal and monetary policy. They increase government spending, the central banks print more money to buy up government debt, they try to encourage more consumption, and so all of this ends up pushing prices higher. And if you look historically at the worst episodes of inflation, they always take place when economies are in recession or depression. You don't have runaway inflation when times are good, right? It's always a horrible economy, a basket case with high unemployment that you see runaway inflation. And that, I think, is the environment into which we're headed. Inflation is going to be rampant. I mean, that's just the way this is going to end up. There's no other politically viable alternative. I don't see the significant cuts to government spending that would be necessary to avoid much higher inflation. I don't see the Fed pursuing the type of monetary policy that would really be necessary to force the government into, making those difficult choices. I think all the factors are going to come down on inflation. They're going to keep on spending money. They're not going to cut anything. Everybody's going to get paid their Social Security benefits and their Medicare benefits and their pensions. The problem is the money's not going to buy very much, because if you need $1,000 to buy a pack of chewing gum, I doubt your Social Security benefits are going to keep pace with that. Even though they do have these cost of living adjustments, they're not going to capture anywhere near the degree to which the cost of living is actually going up. I think there's no question that we are going to suffer very high inflation. Whether it ends up being the type of inflation, we're all trillionaires, because everybody in Zimbabwe, it's not they're all millionaires, they're all trillionaires, right? But what good is a trillion Zimbabwe dollars? Doesn't even buy you a pack of chewing gum for a trillion Zimbabwe dollars. Maybe you could get a stick, I'm not sure. So I don't know that it's going to be that bad, but it's going to be very bad. Certainly it's going to be on an order of magnitude far greater than what Americans experienced during the 1970s. In fact, I think 2021 was as bad, if not worse, than any year of the 1970s. We just didn't measure prices as accurately in 2021 or 2022 as we did back in 1978, 1979, those years where inflation was very high, or throughout the whole decade. So I think it's already been worse than the 70s, but it's going to get a lot worse. And I think the catalyst for inflation kicking into a much higher gear is going to be a large drop in the value of the dollar versus other currencies. That hasn't happened yet. The US dollar index is still, trading around 102. I think once it cracks through 70, that was about the low in 2008, 2011 timeframe. That was a record low for the dollar. I think once we take that out, we're going to be just in free fall territory. And I don't expect the rest of the world to come to the rescue of the dollar the way it did at that period of time, or in the late mid to early 1990s, or in the late 1980s. The world really supported the dollar in its time of need and propped it up. But I think those nations that defended the dollar so vigorously in the past are no longer allies with the dollar. I think a lot of those countries now want out of the dollar. They don't want to try to go out of their way to defend the US dollar's reserve status and to maintain that monetary order. I think a lot of countries are going to take, I don't know if it's pride or be joyful in looking at the dollar's demise, and they're going to maybe feel vindicated or feel that America is getting what it deserves. So I think we're really setting ourselves up for a currency crisis as the dollar loses its status as this reserve currency. That is going to be the impetus for significantly higher price increases in the United States, as all this money that we have been exporting for decades comes back looking to buy stuff. And of course, we don't make much stuff thanks to this system. We've been running these record trade deficits. In fact, we had another horrible trade deficit that came out last week that should have tanked the dollar, and would have, had it been released in the 1980s when people still cared about the trade deficits. But, right now they're not. But they are going to care once the dollar really starts to crack and these trade deficits are unfinanceable. And without the trade deficits, there's nothing to buy, because all the stuff that we buy is being imported, but we're not paying for it. We're just printing money. But when the world doesn't want the money we print anymore, then we're not going to have any ability to get the stuff they produce. And so the supply of goods is going to crash, just as the supply of dollars is going to explode. It's going to be worse than what happened with the COVID lockdowns. You're going to see a bigger supply and demand imbalance when the dollar crashes. This morning, the dollar's up, because somebody at the Bank of Japan, even though they've got 4% inflation officially, which is the highest in 40 years, they're not doing anything about it. In fact, they're bragging about it. They're saying this is great. We dodged a bullet of deflation, so we're happy that we have some inflation now, and so there's no reason to raise interest rates. They're still negative. We don't have to stop printing money and buying Japanese government bonds. They've got the 10-year JGB pegged at about 0.5%. It was pegged at 25 basis points for a while, that they couldn't defend that anymore. So now they're at 50, but you can't defend that either. If inflation is 4%, what idiot is going to loan money for 10 years at 0.5%? But the Japanese have, backed themselves into a corner where they can't fight inflation, so they might as well welcome it and pretend that it's a good thing. But the question is, when are the Japanese people going to revolt about having too much of a good thing? Because inflation is going to keep getting worse in Japan, just like it's getting worse in Europe and the United States. And the reason that inflation is a problem all around the world is because politicians and central bankers made the same mistake in Europe and Japan that they made here. I mean, that's why it's a global problem. It's not that it absolves these politicians. It's the Fed's fault because the politicians all over the world made the exact same mistakes, and now they're all suffering the same consequence.